All right, so today we're talking about creating the Constitution. In our last little section, we talked about the Articles of Confederation and the small list of pros, but mostly cons. And of course, Shays' Rebellion really forces the hand of the federal government to come up with a new form of government, and that is the U.S. Constitution. Really cool thing about the Constitution is it is a living document. And so what that means is there have been changes to the Constitution, but it hasn't been replaced since its inception in 1787. So it is one of the oldest constitutions in the world at this point, because other countries have gone through revolutions or turmoil, or, in some cases like Germany has gone through several different governments in the 20th century alone. So let's jump into it here. Two guys, really, and these are both important guys that we're going to talk about plenty in this course. James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. Madison is going to be a future president. Hamilton never gets there. He has a duel with Aaron Burr. And Aaron Burr, who is the vice president, kills Alexander Hamilton. So we'll get to that chapter. It's a fun, juicy one. But they see what's going on with Shays' Rebellion and start thinking we need a new form of government. And so they come up with a meeting to revise the Articles, not replace them, but just revise them. Washington agrees to attend this meeting, and that convinces a lot of other people. Washington's kind of like the cool, popular kid who, he's going to the party, everyone's going to the party. So they get Washington in on this, and that means that a lot of other states are going to send delegates to talk about revising the Articles. Rhode Island is too cool to come to this meeting. But the reality is Rhode Island is pretty happy with the Articles of Confederation, because Rhode Island is an incredibly small state. It is still the smallest U.S. state. And for that reason, they're kind of really happy with the fact that they have a state power that puts them somewhat equal to other states. So there's going to be 55 delegates in all, but like I said, none from Rhode Island. These delegates meet in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia. And you got to put yourself in the context of not having any air conditioning. So although Philadelphia is a little further north than where we are, where we have our very humid summers, it is incredibly hot. To make matters worse, because they're basically discussing a top secret plan to replace the current form of federal government with a new form, or perhaps revise it. I haven't gotten to the point where they talk about completely trashing it and making a new form, but they close all the windows because they don't want people out in the streets to hear what the discussion's about, right? People are kind of like, yo, what are all those 55 people doing in there? And they don't want anyone in Philadelphia to get the idea that there's going to be a new form of government. If there were rumblings today of creating a new form of government, that might lead some people to start, protesting and anarchy and all kinds of stuff. So it's all secret. Basically, what they come up with for this convention or for this delegation is to have one vote per state and a majority would rule. So although there is 55 delegates from all different states, basically they say, look, all of your delegates are going to have to come to an agreement and we're going to have one vote for the state. They will rewrite the form of government here. That's the ground rule. So they're not leaving without a rewritten Articles of Confederation. They do not anticipate that they're going to make a new form of government. They just wanted to revise the current form. So the biggest issue is this debate over big states versus little states. Okay, if you're a state like Virginia or a state like New York, you're looking at this whole thing and saying, look, we have more people, therefore we are more important. And so that's their argument here, basically. The bigger the state, the bigger role in government they should play. And if you're a state like New Jersey, you're going to say, well, that's not fair, because we're all states and we all fought against the revolution. And just because you have a lot of people doesn't mean you should get to bully us little states around. And so those two plans become known as the Virginia and the New Jersey plan. To go a little bit more in depth on the plans themselves, because some of these details are going to get ironed out and get combined, spoiler alert, into a third plan, which we'll get to here in a second. But the Virginia plan calls for 3 branches of government, which is important for checks and balances. We kind of talked about this in the last section. If you only have one branch, it is extremely likely to become corrupt. So with 3 branches, you can effectively have one branch checked by the other 2. This basically sets forth the idea that we can't have a president who's all powerful acting like a king, right? And that's very much what the Virginia Plan, the Madison and his buddies are arguing here, is that, if we don't have three branches, we're going to have an all powerful king, then we're basically going back 20 years to the colonial time period. They also come up with this plan for the bicameral Congress. They're going to have two groups in Congress. Both of those groups, though, are going to be based on population. And so, again, Virginia is saying, if you have a bigger population, you get more seats in government. Okay. New Jersey, also known as Patterson's plan, he's the delegate from New Jersey. They're calling for a single Congress with a group of executives, which I think they said there would be 9 executives, I want to say, maybe 5, something like that. Basically, there's also going to be equal vote for each state. And this is known as the small state plan. Okay, so every state, whether you're New Jersey sized or Virginia sized, would have equal votes. What they're worried about here, again, as I said earlier, is big states controlling what those little states are going to do. So that's the debate. And like a lot of major debates that happen in American history, there's going to be a compromise. Now, compromise sounds like a great thing, but I want to also kind of frame it a slightly different way. And that is, compromise is neither side gets 100% of what they want, right? If you have a true compromise, you are giving up something to get something in return. So the compromise is based on these two plans. And basically what happens here is the creation of a House and a Senate. The House is going to be population-based, and the Senate is going to be equality-based. So population-based is from the Virginia plan, and equality-based is from the New Jersey plan. So there's going to be two houses. One's called the House, one's called the Senate. And how do we determine the number of delegates in the House? There will be a census every 10 years. That is what the plan states. The good news is they start the census in 1790. And so our census was completed in 2020, or was conducted in 2020, completed in 2021. And that gives us new population counts. And so the exciting thing for North Carolina is that because of the 2020 census, we actually gained a representative in Congress because our state grew at a faster rate in the last 10 years than other states like New York and Ohio. People are moving down from those states to some more southern states in what's called the Sun Belt. So North Carolina grew in population faster than some other states did. So we gained population. We gained a representative in Congress. Another major issue here that pops up is the issue of slavery. And this issue is not going to go away. This is the first compromise of many in American history to try and negotiate the two sides, the pro-slavery and the anti-slavery sides of this. And kind of an interesting thing, I'm going to flip back for a second here, is the Great Compromise is not really regionally based. It's based on the states that are large versus the states that are small. So there's some southern states and some northern states that are large, and there's some southern states and northern states that are small. So this issue is going to be really based on geography. Southern states are more supportive of slavery. That is where most of the slaves in the United States are located, in the South. And that's kind of largely based on agriculture and the fact that northern agriculture is not reliant on a large population of manual labor. A lot of people in the North also maybe don't live on land that is as arable or as farmable. So slavery really takes off in the South. That goes all the way back to 1619 with the first arrival of slaves into the Virginia colony. And they were brought there to harvest tobacco. So, but the debate here is that the North is saying, look, your slaves are not people, so they don't get to count in the population, which will be counted every 10 years in the census. And the South says, well, they are people. We just don't want them to have rights. And so the North is like, you don't want them to have rights, so they shouldn't count in the population. And they go back and forth on this for a while and eventually settle on this number, the 3/5 compromise. There's two ways to think about this. You can either say, mathematically and logically based, that a state would take the slaves population, right? So they would take their regular population and add to that their slaves population. But before they do that, they're going to multiply their slave population by 3/5. Okay, so without getting too mathy as an example here, you're not counting 100% of the slaves, but you're also not counting 0%. So you're counting a little over half of the slaves in your state and adding that to the state's free population of white non-slaves. So the North isn't super happy about that, and the South isn't either. Okay, that's again my definition of compromise. Both sides not 100% happy. Both sides give up something though to get something in return. The North gives up the argument that slaves aren't people, and in return, it means that the Southern populations are not as high as they could be. The South gives up 2/5 of the slave population, but in return, they're able to count slaves that aren't really considered people. They don't treat them like people, at least. Much of the language around slavery in the South is similar to how people would talk about cattle. You would talk about, 500 head of slavery, right? So you would say head of cattle, but you would say, I have 500 heads, which is kind of a way of talking about people in a really derogatory and subjugative way. These slave owners are not really considering their slaves as people, which makes for kind of a strange, uncomfortable situation when you have slave owners having children with their slaves, such as Thomas Jefferson, who is at this debate. Actually, he's over in France, I believe, in the French Revolution. But they also, the second bullet point here is they promised to not interfere with the slave trade for 20 years. So basically, talking about the slave trade is going to be tabled for the next 20 years. This discussion is in 1787. And so about 1808, there's a new law passed that's going to stop the importation of new slaves from Africa and the Caribbean. We'll talk about that when we get there, because Thomas Jefferson, who I just mentioned, is going to be the president when that happens. And you might think that like slave owners are super against that because it's a hit on slavery. But what actually happens is this greatly benefits slave owners because the slaves that are here instantly shoot up in value, right? It's cutting off a supply of new slaves. So the slaves that exist already in North America become instantly more valuable. So slave owners initially are kind of wary of that and saying, well, if they're going to cut off new slaves, then like potentially that could hurt the institution of slavery and it can hurt my bottom line, my profits. But the reality is they are able to sell slaves after 1808 for much higher prices. I didn't forget about this, but the other way to think of the 3/5 compromise is basically you're looking at a slave and saying they are 3/5 of a human. And that is the more moral and difficult way to think of the 3/5 compromise. Our founding fathers sat down and said, Black slaves are not fully human. And that is in the Constitution. It has obviously since been repealed, but in the original version of the Constitution, you can still see it. So difficult parts of our history where we talk about slavery and how our country was founded to protect that institution. Okay, economic issues here. The federal government can tax, coin money, and regulate trade between states. Those were all issues under the Articles of Confederation, if you remember that. We were talking about states having different currencies. We were talking about the federal government not collecting taxes, which of course is going to hurt it in its ability to raise an army. And then the federal government coining money. So now there's a federal currency, not a state currency. There's no North Carolina bucks and South Carolina pesos. There is the US dollar. Dollars are going to be extremely rare in this time. So you might look at something like a penny today and say, well, that's basically worthless. And you have a point. But back in this time period, if you kind of rewind 200 years of inflation, having a dollar bill was quite a rare thing. So that is going to be something that we address later on. So the ratification debate, we have 12 states present, right? Because Rhode Island stays at home. 9 states must agree to this new plan. And then this splits the whole delegation, those 55 delegates, into basically 2 camps. We have the Federalists, who are going to say, we need to sign this document. It's ready to go. Like, let's not let this moment slip. And then you have the anti-federalists who are kind of concerned about the power the federal government's going to have. These anti-federalists are largely people that were benefiting under the Articles of Confederation. And they're also people that liked smaller government. They didn't want a federal government bossing the states around. And so they're going to oppose the new federal government system that is being proposed here, this constitution. What they do is they hold out, basically. They say, look, we need some basic things protected before we're able to jump on board with a new powerful federal government. While they're doing that and they're saying, look, we need these basic rights, three guys, Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay, are going to write a series of arguments. They write this under a pen name named Publius. So Publius is writing all these essays, but there are three of these guys here that are actually doing the work. And they publish these arguments and they argue for all these benefits that the new Constitution would provide for. So they're kind of putting pressure on the Anti-Federalists in a public setting. It's kind of like if you saw a politician go on Fox News or CNN or MSNBC and talk about some major issue. They're trying to talk to the people to say, this is a big deal and the American people care about this, and here's what I'm doing for it. Now, they're doing this in newspapers and publishing these pamphlets, but that is able to swing a lot of the public over this and able to swing a lot of the Anti-Federalists into saying, okay, yeah, there's some really good things in this, even though I'm a little concerned about the federal government. So we're going to skip the videos here and finish off with our 1.6 assessment questions. Again, just a reminder, if you made it this far, some of these questions you're going to see on the quiz. So if you want to write these down on your notes, that would be extremely helpful for you. Our first question here, what event caused state leaders to attend a meeting to discuss the weak central government? That again comes from our previous section, which is Shays' Rebellion. Okay, so Shays' Rebellion is this big wake-up call to people in government saying this form of government, the Articles of Confederation, is not as perfect as initially it was planned. Number two, why would a big state dislike the New Jersey plan? Really, if you think about big states like Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, North Carolina, Virginia to some extent, I think I've said Virginia twice there, but they really don't like the New Jersey plan because it feels like they're giving in to smaller states, and they're states that have bigger populations, right? So they're saying, look, Virginia makes up X percent of this country. Virginia should control X percent of the government. And it's a pretty sound argument, but it's an argument that really only big states are going to accept and like. Number three is the inverse question. Why would a little state dislike the Virginia plan? Well, if you're a little state like New Jersey or Rhode Island even, Rhode Island was so small it didn't even think about the benefits of attending this meeting. But they would say, look, Virginia is an important state, but that doesn't mean that laws passed in Virginia should affect laws in Vermont or laws in New Jersey. There is some debate here about okay, Virginia is a large state and it has slaves. So if Virginia gets its way, then slavery would be legal all throughout the 13 states, which a state like Massachusetts is going to be very much against. Now, Massachusetts would be a larger state, similar to Virginia, but Massachusetts has 0 slaves at this time. They actually outlawed it in their state constitution previous to this meeting. So little states didn't want to be bullied around, basically. Number 4, why was the Three-Fifths Compromise a foreshadowing of the Civil War? What you can see pretty early on with the Three-Fifths Compromise is there are developing two sides. There are the anti-slave sides, mostly located in the north, and the pro-slave sides, mostly located in the south. Those two interests don't go away, and the compromise here just kind of kicks the can down the road for some other later generation of politicians to try and solve. Question 5, the last question, is why might a Bill of Rights be so important to the Anti-Federalists? I don't know if I mentioned this on the last slide, but that was what the Anti-Federalists were holding out for. Basic protections, okay, freedom of speech, freedom of press, right to assembly. The Second Amendment is in there. There's other parts of the Bill of Rights we're going to go a little bit more in depth in our next section, but they're really concerned about this because they fear that a big federal government is going to take away those rights. And if they just sign on to the new U.S. Constitution, they're giving all this power up that they had formerly in the state government. And so the Bill of Rights is important to keep those rights. And I think a lot of times students like to play the game of who's the better side here. And, as much as you might say, I identify more with the Anti-Federalists or I identify more with the Federalists, both sides are really super formational in our government here. Without the Federalists, there is no U.S. Constitution. Without the Anti-Federalists, there is no First Amendment, Second Amendment, etc. And so you got to credit both sides, even if the Federalists were the ones that were saying, look, we need this Constitution. The Anti-Federalists are the ones that are giving us basic rights like the First Amendment, which those rights don't exist in every country on planet Earth. So again, be a little less likely to jump on a side here and more just accepting and praiseworthy of these two groups. Okay. All right. That is all.